Hello and welcome to my channel. We're going to be doing some more Brusho today, but normally you'll be used to seeing me using it quite freely and tipping it on, sprinkling it about quite loosely. Today we're going to be using it a bit more controlled, mixing it on the palette, making the colours up to use it more like a watercolour. And then I will use some sprinkling in the foreground just to get a little bit of texture. So we're going to do a landscape, and I'm going to do an imaginary landscape. So I'm just going to start with a horizon line, and I'm going to leave quite a bit of foreground rather than sky. And I'm doing this in ink, so if it goes wrong I'll have to stop and start again. But with it being imaginary, I don't suppose you can go wrong, can you? So just a horizon and a sofa and a path, or actually I think we'll make it a road, not a path, and that's going to be disappearing off the back of there. Just make that line a bit more solid. Okay, so this pen is one of the ones I've used before, the Faber Castell Pitt Pen. Again, if you haven't seen the review I did of those, I'll put the link to that up here. And this one is a medium. So let me think, we need a few more fields, we need a bit more interest. So a very simplified little drawing. Just if it's some rolling hills in the countryside. And I think we'll do a row of trees coming down here. So it's good now and again just to have a bit of a play out of your imagination. Just see where it takes you. Even just doing something completely abstract now and again. And of course if we've got some trees, we're going to have some different varieties of trees, so might have a few branches showing through as well. So just vary your lines, have a bit of interest. The thing about trees is to get them realistic, they're always going to be, especially when they're in full leaf, they're going to be casting their own shadow underneath them, so get some shading done as well. So just to do that shading, I'm just holding the pen a little bit more lightly, not pressing on as hard, and just doing some light lines. Okay, so some trees down there, and I think to bring the eye in we'll put some down this side as well, or maybe a fence or something. Let's just have a few little trees here. So when you're doing things from the imagination, you've got to sort of think about your scale and how far back things are when you've got things going off into the distance. And let's put some grass down the centre of this road, or make it into sort of a lane rather than a road, so we'll have some grass growing down the centre of it. Maybe this field we should have ploughed. So again, I'm not pressing on oops, I've gone over the horizon, don't worry about that. Not pressing on heavily, and just altering the shape of some of these lines to sort of make the shape of the land. I think where it's gone up over the line there, we could alter that. We could make another hill in the distance. So that's soon mended. Okay, Now let's think. I'm just sort of talking to myself here, aren't I, really thinking about where to go next. So we need a bit more interest in the foreground. So let's say those 3 fields meet there. And let's have another field here. And we'll put a fence along that one. So when you're drawing a fence, as you get nearer to yourself, obviously they're going to be getting bigger, but they're also further apart because the ones in the distance look closer together. And if these are going away again, make them smaller. And then you just join them up with an imaginary wire. Most fences have 2, one a bit lower down. Okay, and I think we'll put some plants now at in the foreground. So let's put some grasses going towards the road here. Because these are right in the foreground, so they're going to be a lot taller than anything we've got further back. So when you're doing things like grasses with a pen, especially when it's a pen like this, which is an evenly sized pen, so you're not making interesting lines like you would be with a dip pen, because all your lines are a similar size. The only thing you can do is vary your pressure and vary the angle of your line. So with grass, you really need to get them going in all directions. Unless you want to give a sense of the wind coming over, and then you might want them all going as if they're being blown by the wind. And again, they're going to be making some shadow underneath themselves, casting their own shadow on the ground down here. So again, we can make that a bit darker just with some shading. You can see I've made a margin here. I thought that'd be useful for us testing the colours when we come to putting a colour on, testing them in the margin. Now then, let's go over to this side. Again, we'll make another hill coming down here. I don't think I want too much detail on this side. Let me just think. Could do with some trees or something coming down. So we'll put another row of trees here. This is just an A5 pad, so it's not too big. Just the mixed media paper that I've used before in the past that I really like. I'm going to have to buy another one of these. It's getting towards the end now, so I will be buying another one because I really like this paper. And again, if you didn't see that review, I will put that in the link as well, because I know some of you might not have seen that. It was a while ago. Like I say, I've nearly filled this pad up now. Maybe one or two actual tree shapes you can sort of recognise. Come a bit closer to us. And if you think you need some more detail later, you can put some more detail in with the the paint. Now looking at this now, I was talking about scale before, we've now got trees here smaller than the fence here, so we're going to have to take those a lot further up. So that was a mistake. Like I say, you need to think about that. You see now how that looks better, because we've got the fence at that side smaller than the trees at this side. These could be just some shrubby bushes further down, but if we take some up, it gives a sense of scale. And these are some shrubs going up into the distance. Okay. And again, we'll have some more grass in the foreground here. Not just as heavy as the other side, but just an indication that it's much more in the foreground and nearer to us. You could even put some sort of buds on, you know, little ends on, as if we've got some rushes and things. Make a bit more interest, put some leaf shapes in here and there. Doesn't matter if you don't know what type of flower it is or what type of plant that you're doing, just some random leaf shapes. It's going to make it a bit more interesting. And again, we need some shade under here. I'm sorry, the camera actually just cut off a little bit at the end there, so I was just doing this shade in here and putting some random leaf shapes on these and saying it doesn't matter what plant they are, we'll just make it quite random. I did an extra little field here, and then I just put these lines up here just to distinguish between the road and the verge of the road there. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the sky. So I've got just a few colours, and I'll tell you what I've got. I've got moss green, cobalt blue, sunburst lemon, grey, red and burnt sienna. So to begin with, we'll put some cobalt in the sky. And I'm just going to use one brush to do the whole thing, so let's see what number it is. And it's rubbed off. So it'll be about a number 6 round brush. And it's a synthetic one. So I've got some cobalt there and mixed it in, and as you can see it's quite bright, so I'm going to add plenty more water to that. And just quickly do the sky. I don't know whether to make it a cloudy day or a clear day. Do the whole thing to begin with. So like I say, it's this mixed media paper, so it's not going to take as much water as one of your watercolour papers would. But when you're doing it quite small like this, you're not going to be using masses and masses of water, keeping it quite tidy. But you'll see I've got it clipped at the end with some bulldog clips just in case it does start to warp. Try and keep it nice and flat, the wash that you're putting on. And I'll just get rid of that little bit that's gone over the edge of the hill there. So just with a damp brush, don't forget it's not like watercolour, it's much more of a dyes Brusho. So it might not just come off, but you can just blend it in to form a bit of a shadow on the top of that hill. Now then, I'm going to make some grey and put some of that into the sky to make it look as if it's a bit of a darker day. So if you did want some clouds in your sky, you would have to leave the paper white, because you can't lift the Brusho out like you would lift your watercolours out. The grey is quite a a purpley grey, but it's actually quite pretty. And because the blue underneath is still quite damp, that's just blending in quite nicely. There's a few sort of cloud shapes there. I'll just come back to the top edge and put some extra pigment in, just to make it darker at the top. It helps frame the picture as well. Now at this stage, whilst it's still wet, I think I'm just going to add a tiny touch of the yellow to the underside of those clouds, as if it's perhaps starting to come evening and you've got the sun going down and touching the bottom of those clouds, but this needs doing while it's wet and you only need to touch a tiny little bit in. And can you see how this sunburst lemon moves the other pigments out of the way? Then get a damp brush, so I've dipped it in the water and then I've dried it off with my fingers, and just carefully blend that into the grey and reshape those clouds whilst that's still wet. Now if you'd done that with watercolours, you'd have much muddier colours, and that yellow would have mixed with the blue quite a bit to go into green, which you don't want green in your sky. But with this sunburst lemon, it really stays quite lemony, quite yellow. So even when you put it on top of the blue, it still looks quite yellow. So I'm going to just put a little bit on the horizon there as well. And again, I'm just getting a damp brush. Sorry, I knocked the camera then. Just hoping it doesn't go off again. So just a damp brush and just tidying up the top edge. And then leave that to dry, don't fiddle with it too much. So coming down, if we want the furthest away hills to look further away, we need them to be more blue and less yellow. So if we want them to be actually green, we want some green, but we want to put some blue into it. So I'll just mix some of the moss. The moss green's probably one of the more natural looking colours. Oops, that's gone into the yellow. One of the more natural looking colours in the Brusho. And if you haven't used the colours before and you're not sure which colour to try, like I said before, just test them on the side. That's why it's a good idea to have a margin. So I'm going to take some of that moss. I don't know if you can see my palette or not, but I'm going to move some of it into the centre there and add some of that blue to it. So I've got quite a blue-green towards the back of the picture. But still nice and bright. And using plenty of water so that the lovely white paper showing through. That's the other thing I like about this pad, it's nice and white. And it's quite warm in here, so it's drying quite quickly. So that bit that we went over the line there with is already dry. And I'll just go over those trees, and then once it's dry I'll come back and go darker over the top of them. So the reason you need quite a small brush, well not too small, is obviously so you can get into these corners where you've done these fields and things, and the thing is you need a nice point to your brush. So it's not an expensive brush, just a synthetic one, but you do need to look for one that's got a good point so you can get into corners and things. Now to start coming closer to us, I don't know if you saw before, but I actually spilt some of the moss into that yellow. So I'm going to mix a little bit more into that yellow. And do the next field a slightly different green, just gives us a bit of variety as well. And I'll use that same colour on this field here, and again I'll go straight over the trees and come back later when the whole thing's dried to put more detail in the trees with a different colour. So can you see when I'm trying to cover a lot in a short space of time, I use the whole of the side of my brush. I'm not just going like this, I'm using my brush which is filled with paint to cover the whole, more of the paper at once. Whoops. I'm very good at going over the lines. I'm not usually such a tidy worker. You'll see by some of my other things that I do that I usually work much more loosely than this, but it's good now and again to try something different. And I thought this would be a good exercise for the beginners as well, really. Because once you've got your drawing and you're happy with your drawing, the painting is the easy bit really. And also, of course, you could have done your drawing in pencil first until you're completely happy with it, and then gone over in ink and rubbed your pencil marks out. Again, I'm just tidying off those edges where I've gone over. So the ploughed field needs to be much more brown, so I'm going to now mix some of the burnt sienna, which is a little bit red actually. I'm just wondering if I could put some blue into it perhaps. So I'm just going to mix some of the blue into that to make it more brown. Let's just test it. It's still quite ready. Let's perhaps put a bit of the grey as well. And that's sort of a soily colour. Yeah, that's not too bad for a soil. So this time we won't go over the trees because we want the trees to be green, so we'll go around those this time. So that was the burnt sienna with a tiny touch of the cobalt blue and a little bit of the grey, just to knock it back a bit and take that red out of it and make it a bit more natural looking. When you're painting, paint in the direction of the way the land's lying as well. We've got another little ploughed field over here, so whilst we've got that on the palette, we'll just do that little bit as well. Okay, and then we'll just go over with one of the greens that we had earlier over these trees. Like I say, we'll come back and put a bit more depth into those after they've dried. So this field here we need to be a little bit more yellow. So I'm going to get some more of the lemon out into there. I don't think the camera will pick it up, excuse me, because it's only very, very tiny, but this was a little bit damp. So some of this soil colour is going up slightly into that, but it's only very, very slightly. So if you were worried about that, you could leave each field to dry completely in between, rather than risk the colours merging together. For the purposes of the video, I just wanted to carry straight on. Now I think we'll make the verge that same colour as well, so that we've got that distinction between the road and the verge there. So we're straight over the top of the fence because obviously the fence is showing through. So again, another reason we need plenty of water is to let those ink lines show through. We don't want to ruin, go over the drawing completely. So this is why Brusho are very economical, because you only need a few little pigments mixed with plenty of water to do a painting. And this little field here will make it even sunnier, I think. Let's just make it completely yellow, that one. So we'll mix some more yellow in another area of the palette, and then it's nice and clean. So I haven't done too much colour mixing. I've just added some blue to the green in the distance to send that back, and some yellow to the greens in the foreground to make that come forward. And this last field will do this yellow as well. So we've got, as well as the colours giving us that distance, we've got this road going off into the distance, which is also going to sort of reinforce that, so makes a little pretty little landscape. More water. Quite nice for something like a child's bedroom in all these bright Brusho colours. So I'm not sure what colour to do the lane. I think we'll do it a very pale grey. So I'm going to take some of the grey that I had before. I'm going to put plenty of water in another area of the palette, and then just take a touch of that and add it to the water, so it's very, very pale. Now I'm going to go for a moment and come back when the whole thing is completely dry. Okay, so now it's completely dry. I'm just going to pick a little bit of this green up that we've got left and pop the grass down the centre of this lane. So coming wider as it gets closer to us. And do a few flicks at the bottom so we can tell it's grass. And then we're going to go over these trees. So we need more of the moss green. Just on its own. And we'll go over the trees. And those bushes in the bottom there as well. Okay, now whilst those trees are still wet, we'll get the sunburst lemon, and we'll take the lid off, carefully, very carefully, and with a very, very dry, fluffy little brush, just pick up a touch of the colour, and this way you've got lots of control. Knock off the excess. You need to be very cautious about doing this. Gently tap the brush into where it's wet, but you must do this while it's still damp. It's drying a little bit quickly. Perhaps got it on a little bit thickly there, but it doesn't matter. So we'll put the lid back on to be safe so we don't knock that pot over. Now it would have been better if it wasn't just as dry as that, so what I'm going to do is get my brush and gently drop some water onto where I put the Brusho. Don't touch it, don't move the Brusho around. You can get your spray and gently spray as well. I'm not sure how much the camera picks up of this yellow now moving out into the water. I'm hoping it's going to pick it up. You wouldn't have needed to do this if the Brusho hadn't dried out, the green hadn't dried out quite so quickly. It's because I've got all the heaters on in here, because it's very cold outside. You can also use a spray. I'll just show you what I mean. I've got a spray here. But of course, when you use your spray, you risk hitting bits of the paper that you don't want to. So you can guard it off with your hand or with a piece of paper. Just putting a bit extra on there. Now whilst it's wet, I'm just going to drag some of that down with the brush, but don't be fiddling too much, don't be scrubbing it around the paper. Let it do its own thing now. So the pigment's in there, and just leave it to merge into the trees. Let's take a little bit up those. Okay, so we'll do this down here, and we'll do this, keep it much more wet. So what we're going to do with these grasses is we'll wet the paper first. So I'll do these grasses at this side first. I'll wet the paper, but I'll wet it in the direction of the grass. So I'll put the water on and flick it up. So as you're coming along, lift your brush off the paper so you get some nice grass shapes. So you won't be able to see that because that's just clear water. And then we'll just tip some of the moss in straight out of the pot. You could do this again with the brush if you preferred, if you didn't want to risk it coming out too quickly. Okay, and then to cheer it up as well, we'll put a touch of the lemon in. Oops. So that's what happens when you don't use the brush method. But what will happen now with this is, after it's dried, I'll just be able to tip that little bit off and brush it away. So this side, exactly the same thing. Some nice clean water, so make sure you keep your pots of water clean. And go over everywhere where you've added those leaf and grass shapes. And again, some of the moss. and some of the Sunburst Lemon. Now, one of the biggest mistakes people make with Brusho at this stage is to start fiddling about with it and start adding extra, because it will carry on moving and it will be quite a while before all these colours have merged together and moved into each other. If you start adding more and more colour now, it's just going to go to mud. So you need to leave it at this stage completely. You could always come back to it tomorrow when it's completely dry and add some extra things then, but don't start fiddling around with it now, adding anything extra. So I'm just where I've just dripped that water into there, we've got some running over, so I'll just take that off into the margin. And also here, so with a dry brush, just suck that extra water up with your brush. Completely dry your brush off, and then and that could be a little bit of sunshine on the side of the hill there. We've ended up with a little touch of yellow. Okay, so that's something you could do as well at this stage if you wanted to add some extra texture or shape to some of these fields. Just with a little bit of the Sunburst Lemon, you can just add some lines over the top to make it a little bit more interesting. Or with some of the greens. Okay, so I'm going to call that done, and I will show you it. I will take a photograph of it once it's completely dry, and you'll see just how much all this changes overnight as it all dries together. Don't dry it with a hairdryer. Again, that's another mistake people make with Brusho. Don't dry it with a hairdryer. It needs to react with the water, and it needs all those colours to make those lovely patterns merging into each other. If you do it with a hairdryer, you won't get those nice effects. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that. Like I say, I'll show you how it looks once it's dry. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a go at that little exercise and let me know how you get on in the comments below. Thank you. Bye.